Good evening to those in Australia and good morning to those in Europe. Welcome to the series on the European Conservative Leadership on Climate and Environment. I'm Cristina Telaco, Chair of Coalition Conservation, and I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community, paying respect to their elders, past and present. As some of you are aware, we've hosted a number of events with the UK Conservatives last year, and we wanted to expand our reach to other European conservatives. So we were thrilled when Connie Hedegaard agreed to be our guest of honor. And it's also a pleasure to have Jason Collins with us. Jason is the CEO of the European Australian Business Council and the chair of the European Business Organizations Worldwide. As for the format of our event tonight, we'll first hear Connie's address. Then we'll have a conversation with Connie, followed by a Q&A. So if you wish to ask her a question, please type in the Q&A box. After the Q&A, I'll invite Jason to do the final remarks. So the webinar will be recorded. The recording will be circulated to everyone who registered. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our special guest, Connie Hedegaard. Connie is an international climate expert. She's a member of Denmark's Conservative People's Party, DKF, and she has an impressive environmental track record. She served as Danish Minister for Climate and Energy, served as Minister for the Environment. She hosted the UN Climate Conference, COP15 in Copenhagen. Connie was also European Commissioner for Climate Action, and she developed the EU Emission Trading Scheme. And currently she chairs the OECD's Roundtable on Sustainable Development, and she sits on many boards, including the Volkswagen's Sustainability Council, the European Council of Foreign Relations, and the European Climate Foundation. So good morning, Connie, and thank you so much for joining us here in Australia. I'll quickly hand it over to you because we want to hear about your experience as a key figure in keeping climate change at the top of the European agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you very much for having me, but also thank you very much for this initiative. I've had the distinct pleasure twice to visit your wonderful country. And I must say that it has been striking to me sort of how polarized sometimes the climate debate were, at least years back in Australia, and maybe particularly among the right of center parties. So for me, being a conservative, as you mentioned, from Denmark, that has always been a bit of a puzzle. How come it was so polarized? You know, since I was very young, I've never understood why environment, sustainability, and now climate, why should that be a particular socialist or leftist topic? Conservatism comes of conservare. You know, we say that we should change to preserve. The grandfather of conservatism, Edmund Burke, said that society is a contract between those who are dead, those who are living, and those yet to be born. That contract between generations, I think it's fair to say that, for instance, for conservatives in Denmark, that would normally be some of the things that we are very sort of outspoken about, pronounced about, when we say what is sort of the core of conservatism, then that would be sort of the contract between generations would come out among sort of the first things. And if that is sort of our point of philosophical departure, so to speak, that we must leave society at least as good as we found it to the next generation, then for sure we have a lot to do with today's climate, sustainability, environment challenges. Actually, in Denmark, in my country, when the new modern environment movement started in the late 60s, early 70s, it was actually a then conservative finance minister who was one of the profiles. He said sort of we should get rid of smoke, noise, and dung. That was the time with air quality problems, open landfills, you know, all these kind of things. And then in 1973 in Denmark, we had two severe oil crises. Oil from Saudi Arabia simply stopped to come. And that was sort of the start of the new energy focus in Denmark, because then suddenly we had to rethink the whole energy system. And we really started to address efficiency, very, very much efficiency. And later, we also really focused on renewables in order not to be dependent on imported fossil fuels. So that was sort of how this green adventure, as it has turned out to be today, really started. You could also say in the 80s, we had more than 10 years with a conservative Prime Minister Schluter. And there it was water quality, the pollution from agriculture and what it did with acidification and things like that. That was a big issue. But then we have this tradition in Denmark that we also now see in the European Parliament reflect. I'll come back to that just briefly. But we have the tradition in Denmark to have broad political agreements, to be very much cooperating right, left, and center, particularly maybe when it comes to the big issues, but very much in energy, where you sort of take decisions for many years ahead. So maybe that is also why in Denmark we never had a Green Party. So the parties sort of also had to compete a bit on their environmental profile. Does that then mean that there was never discussion and the conservatives, the liberals just followed sort of others? No, there were, of course, sometimes discussion on how fast to accelerate, how much should we subsidize. There were definitely discussions. Nonetheless, people managed to do the broad agreements, 3-year, 4 or 5 years agreements that sort of stood and had to be respected. So there's been sort of a certain continuity in Denmark. But then that was, how could we sort of have, as a conservative party, a liberal, how could they sort of come along this? I think that for many years now, it has been because to focus on climate and environment sustainability, it has been a driver for our growth. It has been a driver for job creation. In the last few decades, we have created more than 60,000 new jobs in the productive sector, in the green field. The export is just really going up. Today, 13.5% of our total export is green technology. 20 years ago, it was basically nothing. So that has been a very, very strong driver for carrying also the right of center party and the industry behind these things. And one thing that may be interesting also to Australia, we have seen that many of these jobs have come in the rural areas. You know, there have been so much job creation around the big cities, but here actually you had a lot of subcontractors for district heating, for wind turbines, for whatever, out in the rural areas. So today, I think it's fair to say that it has become an industrial agenda. And when in 2019, we had a new government that came up with a very ambitious target of minus 70% reduction, or 70% reduction in CO2 by 2030. The right of center parties, the conservative parties also, wow, this is extremely ambitious. It took 2 weeks. Then the Confederation of Danish Industries came out and said, we support this. And that led to almost all parties in parliament, without 2 very small parties. But the rest made a binding climate law that is now being sort of discussed and implemented. So just to wrap up this short presentation, does that mean then that, well, that was never sort of really differences? Yes, there are differences. I think that one of the differences would be, do you want growth or do you pretend that you can stop growth? There's no discussion in Denmark, of course, that the right of center parties, conservatives, would say we need growth. And we need a balance between market and regulation. And that is why one of the big topics next will be how to handle the question of a CO2 price. We have CO2 prices, but should it be increased even more? For instance, right now in Norway, last month, the Norwegian conservative prime minister from the oil and gas state of Norway in an election year presented a proposal to increase the Norwegian CO2 tax to 300 Australian dollars. I mean, it's significant. And why is that? That's because that economists would say that in a market economy, you must make the right price incentive, and that is to be preferred over a lot of regulation. So that's some of the big discussions we have now in Denmark, and that I'm sure we will also have even more in Europe. And just final point, behavior is also coming up. And that is a very tricky thing when you have a conservative approach, because you should not interfere with what people choose to eat or how they behave. On the other hand, to sort of emphasize the responsibility of the individual, that is also a conservative core value. So how do you balance that with the right incentive structure and with labeling, making it possible for people to take an informed choice? Very last point, Christine, you said about Europe. You know, now that we have the European Green Deal, we can come back to that. We have the recovery package, where 1/3 of 750 billion euros set aside for the recovery after COVID-19. 1/3 of that has been earmarked to climate purposes. And for the rest, 2/3 is a principle that must be applied: do no harm to climate. I think that maybe it's no coincidence that the overall headline of this big European endeavor is a next generation Europe, because it's spearheaded by two conservatives, the president of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. So I think that you will see that sort of to conservatives in Europe, to take care of climate is a core value, because it is aligned with the philosophical core, but of course also because it's hard to be leading parties in the 21st century without really embracing these big challenges for mankind. I think I will stop there and then listen to your questions.
Thank you, Connie. Very refreshing to see the alignment of conservatism with conservation and the conservatives in Europe. As you know, in Australia, it's been a little bit harder and a bit more difficult to reach this bipartisanship on climate, especially when it comes to things like carbon pricing and all sorts of other things to do with climate. So you must have had some pushbacks at some stage, obviously, during your time as minister, trying to advance a climate agenda. So how did you work, in overcoming those pushbacks whenever you wanted to push something forward?
Well, of course, there have been lots of pushbacks. For instance, at some point, that was just before I was minister, they canceled in Denmark 2 planned wind farm parks. And that was criticized so much. You cannot imagine it. When they looked down in the polls, they could just see that whether you are a socialist or you are a conservative or whatever you are, people in Denmark thought this was not smart, and the industry was sort of also protesting. So there have been many of these things. But for instance, during the financial crisis in Europe, when I was at the European Commission, it was interesting when then President of the Commission, Barroso, went to the summits with all the heads of states in the middle of this crisis, and he sort of advocated that we should do more in the climate field. What was it that he could present to them? He could present that the job growth potential is enormous in the green sector, in health and in communication, but those will be the 3 growth sectors job-wise in Europe. And that was basically what even during the very, very tough economic crisis in Europe made it possible still to push forward climate policies, because people saw the economic growth potential and the jobs potential. Plus also remember one more thing, we have in Europe been very dependent on imported fuels from outside, for instance, from Russia, and also from other regimes where we do not want to be too dependent. So that has also always been a factor in the energy and climate policy, at least.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that the climate agenda has turned into an industrial agenda to generate jobs and align with job growth, because of course, we have to transition from coal. The issue in Australia is always obviously related to the coal communities and the coal mining that's still strong here. So for that transition to happen without hurting people, how do you transition, bringing everyone along and not leaving anybody behind, is another question. I know with the European deal, I'd like to touch upon the European deal because it's a very ambitious plan for Europe. But how do you see the European deal as this pathway to net zero, bringing everyone along without leaving anyone behind?
Yeah, that's a key question. You could say that in Europe, we have examples in Spain, in Britain, in the Ruhr district of Germany, in northern part of France, old coal communities that have now transferred themselves into sort of a new thing. For instance, the old Ruhr district in Germany, today it's high tech. So we have examples. How can you move from A to B? How can you phase out the coal mining industry and then create new jobs elsewhere? But it's clear that, for instance, if you are in Poland and you still have 100,000 people employed in the coal sector in a key part of Poland, you would say, yeah, it's very interesting with all these green ambitions, but what do we do with all these people? So what we are trying to do now is to say that the common budget of EU, there are some regional funds, and there it must be, the money will be much more earmarked for purposes where you actually go in and make this change, find the best practices. How do we do that? Reskill and upskill people, make the long-term plan. It's of course nothing you can do in 2 or 3 or 4 years. It takes 10 years. So you have to have a plan. How do you do this? How do you make the transformation? And then have the EU budget to support you. Where, for instance, some of the coal-based nations, like for instance, Poland, they are also one of the big recipients of money from the community budget in EU. So the budget is a key there. Another thing is energy efficiency, because energy poverty, for instance, is also in some of the member states in Europe, it's still a key issue. But there it goes without saying, to make energy efficiency initiatives. That is also what brings down the cost to live for those who are not so well off. So energy efficiency also has this social component. If you find innovative, smart ways of financing the initiatives, and there are really many good examples of how to do that.
Yeah, energy efficiency in Australia is still lacking a little bit. We're not very energy efficient. The houses are not properly insulated and things like that. And it's an area that I know the Europeans are trying to do a lot and put a lot of money towards, especially the UK. I was going to bring Jason in because he represents obviously a lot of Australian European companies in the energy sector. So I wanted to ask him and him to ask you and interact more about how do they make a difference and what are they doing, the corporates, that government can follow?
Thanks, Christina, and Connie, great delight to see you again. I had the great fortune to be in Copenhagen during the COP15, which you chaired back in 2009, I think, and also your visits to Australia. As Chris has mentioned, there's a huge amount of focus and attention here in Australia, but also, as we know, internationally. This is a very big year for the climate agenda, and there are so many complex issues we need to manage. One thing I should mention is, while there is a great deal of focus on national government policy, there is a great deal that is positive that is happening here in Australia, whether it be in terms of the sheer volume of investment in the renewable energy sector, which is greater than anywhere in the world, but also too, it's very much a European-Australian story, because it's most of the big operators in the renewable space are in fact European companies. And whether it be in investment operators or indeed the technology behind them, Siemens, Vestas from your home country in Denmark, all here in Australia and making a big impact. I remember when you came to Australia, I think it was your counterpart then was Greg Combet as the Minister for Climate Change. There was discussion then about linking an Australian ETS to the European ETS. Now, of course, Australia has gone in a different direction. In Brussels at the moment, as you know, there is a talk of introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism to analyse the embedded emissions within traded goods. How difficult can you see it to be to effectively deal with these sorts of issues at an international level in the absence of there being an ETS framework around them?
That's a good question, Jason. You see, the background is that Europe for many, many years have tried to say we should have a global price on carbon, others should have that. That was what the sort of linking discussion also was all about. We've been working with China to set up sort of their emissions trading scheme. Excuse me. But at some point when you get even more ambitious, and now we have set for all of Europe at least 55% reduction of CO2 by 2030, then the carbon leakage problem grows. The fact that those that you are competing with, they do not have the cost of doing something about climate. And therefore this border carbon adjustment mechanism has come up more and more. And Ursula von der Leyen, she has announced that by June, the Commission, EU Commission, will present a specific proposal. Sorry. So I think that in one way or the other, EU will move forward on this, saying that if you have your own system, fine, but if you don't do anything or you don't have the cost, then because it's not in order to secure that it's not unfair to our companies, we will have some kind of border tax. I think that it is absolutely key that EU will reach out to other economies to take care that this will not end up in a total trade war nightmare. But I think that with the election of President Biden, there is also new interesting chances to work with the US on this, because actually Biden in his campaign announced that they should do something in that direction in the US. And I even happen to know that there are Republicans behind the scenes in Congress, some of the strategic advisors that are working on something similar. At the OECD roundtable, we have had some roundtables on this, and there have been American participation before the elections, and also from the Republican side. And they are doing white papers and so on and so forth, because they know that at some point in modern trade regimes, we have to address this problem. So I would assume that the EU Commission now is very busy reaching out to the new US administration to work together on this, and hopefully if they could sort of get to some kind of understanding from there, start to build and work with others. I know there's an initiative in New Zealand working with a number of smaller countries on how to do this in one way. There are different models circulating, but I would really hope that we could do this in a good manner with a dialogue. But I think that one should not just hope that it will disappear, because it will not. We have sort of kept it in the toolbox for many years in Europe, but now some kind of levy is going to come. That would be my assumption.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chris, perhaps if I could ask one more question before handing over to the room. I'm sure there's a amount of questions that have come through. The second question, if I may, is about transition. So each country, as you mentioned, has had a different story in terms of where they've come from, where they're headed to. So I think if I remember correctly, in Denmark, there's been a major use of biomass as a transition from coal to renewables and to low emissions. In Australia, very much a coal dependent in the past, and that will transition as well. And there's a great focus on natural gas being the transition vehicle, if you like, for Australia. Some debate on whether government intervention may be needed to build gas-fired in order to get to the low transmissions future. Just wondering if you could comment a bit further on that transition phase. And we know that, for example, in Europe, there's an equal, in some quarters, there's an equal hostility to gas as a transition fuel. But I think the story is different in different places. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that sort of transition phase that we're in.
Yeah, that's right. It's always easy to set the targets, but how to get there, how to get from A to B. And you're right that in Denmark, we have done it through a lot of biomass, but also, by the way, through a lot of gas. Now gas is being replaced by central district heating, where we have burned our waste, and that is translated into sort of energy. So gas is being more and more phased out. So it's sort of, you know, bridge after bridge after bridge until you get to where you need to go. In Europe, there is a huge debate right now, as you're also alluding to, on sort of gas. Is gas sort of the bridge, or would there be a risk that there are too many stranded assets if we are really going to achieve the very, very ambitious targets for only 2 or 3 decades from now? Because then what do you do with that gas plant that you built today? So I think that there is, the jury is still out, but the big buzzword these days in Europe is electrification of transport, electrification of heating. And that is, of course, because we see a future where in the end, it's very much on renewables. There'll be a component of nuclear, but most of that will be renewables. So that is the big plan. But say if you're Poland, they are expanding a lot now in renewables, but still if you have to replace your coal capacity, say in 10 years, yes, then maybe gas will have to be a bridging technology there. And we are still expanding gas connectors throughout Europe. I think also for Germany, that's also the way that they can go out of coal, that would be to bridge through gas. So that is the discussion there. And then I think in Europe, the big discussion is now also hydrogen. And we have seen sort of a new sort of hydrogen alliance, where both the EU authorities will go in and institutions, but very much also businesses. Businesses that normally would see themselves as competitors have started to come together much more proactively in this discussion and say, how can we work together on this, on power to X, on some of the new technologies? Because I think it's fair to say that to European industrialists, this whole climate agenda and the transition, it's a question of innovation and development, and also, to be frank, the competition with China and others who move quickly when they move, that we sort of, there is a new recognition that we have to work together in public-private partnerships, but also across normal company lines in order to be a bit more agile and fast when we innovate. So I think that the big thing right now is to see this as a huge opportunity for the European economy, but also a huge failure, a huge risk if we are too slow in actually delivering on the many good promises and targets.
And Connie, you mentioned the new technologies and renewables. Do you see opportunities between Australia and Europe, since in Australia, much of the solutions for the climate crisis are really being based on this roadmap where we're putting a lot of effort towards new technologies and developing new technologies to really come with solutions for us. So do you see that there's any way that Australia could benefit, and obviously Europe, from this transition by the use of new technologies?
Yeah, I think we would need a lot of new technologies, but we would also need to stand a bit more on each other's achievements, so to speak. So I sometimes wonder how come in a very digitalized world that so many nations still have to reinvent sort of their own solutions. How come we are not better at sharing best practices and cooperating on these things? So I think that there should be big opportunities there. And I think the moat is also that it requires something new of us in the way we work together, because it's dawning on more and more people that the urgency here, I mean, we have to deliver really substantial change within a relatively short time frame. How do we do that with our normal ways of doing things and a bit slow? I mean, how can we be a bit more nimble, a bit more agile? One thing that may be interesting for Australian business is something that we started in Norway. I was involved in something up there for the Norwegian Prime Minister, where, to make a long story short, it ended up with 17 different sectors making each their roadmap for 2050. And where they said, where are there some barriers for we could do more? which ones can we remove ourselves? What more can we do ourselves in our respective businesses and sectors? Where are there some political framework conditions that policymakers must address? And where do we need some new technologies? And that idea was then sort of imported to Denmark, actually also Sweden. So in Denmark, we last March got 13 different climate partnerships, as we called it, each describing what can they do. The energy sector, agriculture, transport, fishing, production, each of them with a whole host of initiatives. And you could say, oh, is that just a big wish list for government? No, it was also something where government could go down there and say, oh, there is a gap there that we need to address. And then there is this forum where the 13 chairmen, and that is the top notch of CEOs, 13 in Denmark, plus a few more, we are there in a council. And there the government can sort of test ideas. So instead of business and industry sitting there waiting for what would the policymakers come up with some kind of crazy regulation, they themselves have tried to identify what is important for our sector. And that makes it maybe somewhat easier for the government when they are going to say, well, how are we going to deliver on the binding targets here? That makes it easier to go down there and see a lot of very specific proposals and ideas that have already been sort of agreed among key stakeholders within a given sector. So I think that process has worked very well, and now both in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark.
Sounds like a very good initiative. I might open to the audience now because we have lots of questions, and one interesting one that I really want to know your thoughts on is what is the impact on the Biden actions on climate, and what do you think needs to happen at COP26 to see this ramping up global climate action?
Well, it's early days to say what would be the impact, but alone the fact that on his very first day, or inauguration day, that President Biden then sort of signed the paper so that US could re-enter in the Paris Agreement. And as I see it, that means re-enter on the international stage when it comes to climate. That is extremely important. I mean, we don't know as of yet how much can they really do domestically in the US. And even during the Trump years, we have seen a lot of activities in their cities, in their states, governors and mayors, and many business have been doing a lot of things. Investors have been really changing the way they see things in the United States. So in the US, no matter who is the president, what the administration, then a lot of things will always be happening on the ground. But I think it means a lot that the US is back on the international stage. I really hope that John Kerry and the EU, I'm sure that they will sort of really do some, sit together, try to discuss through what should happen the next year. And hopefully, if that is successful, then if EU and the US could sort of start the dialogue again with China. EU has been having this dialogue all the time, but if those three big partners could sort of start off to a positive start, I think we'll get some indications on April 22nd, where the President Biden has announced that they will make a major economist meeting. So Australia and many others will be there, and that would be sort of the first time actually in 4 years where the international community can have a frank and open discussion around these things. I guess that COP26 can deliver something. We don't even know whether it will be a virtual COP or it can be a physical COP. So I'm always a bit cautious that we are not overemphasizing what can be achieved through that COP. They should agree sort of what is called the rule book, a lot of technicalities. But I think that outside the COP, around the COP, the interesting thing is that many of the big players, they are starting to deliver, starting to set targets, starting to come up with pricing, and really, starting to transform specific sectors, cement, aluminum, the car sector. I saw this week that General Motors announced that by 2035, they would have produced their last combustion engine car. I mean, if only 1 year ago we had said that General Motors would come out with such a statement, was our dream on. Things are really starting to happening. And I think that is key for COP26 to sort of grasp all these things and inject a new kind of optimism that, yes, we can do this, and their American leadership is needed. I mean, let's be frank, when was it was possible to do what came out to be the Paris Agreement in 2015? That was when President Obama, in his last years in office, really started to have a decent dialogue with the Chinese leadership. Then things started to move. And I think with Xi Jinping's announcement around 2060 and with the next Chinese 5-year plan coming up, I think that there is really good chances that we could have a new dynamic rolling here. If I may, sorry for the long answer, Christina, basically I also think that one thing that is really changing things right now is that the investor community is changing. I don't know if you saw this week, Exxon, for the first time in its history, came out with a deficit. And not only that, a deficit of $20 billion. BP, the same, for the second time. They had this big disaster some years ago where they had 1 year with a deficit, but also else it has never happened before. And Blackstone comes out and say, BlackRock comes out and say, we will really now withdraw from all fossil fuel investing companies. I mean, there are some profound things happening in the investment community that trickles down to business and where they sort of prioritize to invest. I mean, when that starts in a capitalist, market-based society, then things really start to happen.
Certainly. And you are quite an expert in climate resilience. We didn't touch upon that during your address, but you have such deep knowledge in these areas of adaptation. And now with COVID, and here in Australia, we had lots of bushfires last year, and it's just an important area as in reducing emissions. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience in these adaptation technologies, how you develop this strong science and economic base for the Europeans on that front?
Yeah, there has been for many years, when I was a commissioner, we did an adaptation strategy, but that is always a bit challenging because the differences are so big, and you will know that also from the different provinces in Australia. So much of the authority when it comes to specific adaptation initiatives will often lie with the communities, with the cities, decentralized. But for instance, now all EU member states must have a national adaptation strategy. We try to sort of have a common entrance digitally, where you could sort of, if you're sitting out there somewhere, you are dealing with, be it bushfires or droughts or flooding or whatever problem you have, you could go in and see what are the best practices, which kind of technologies work, what has been proven, what does not work, try to shortcut a bit to the good solutions. And now the EU is revising its adaptation strategy. It will be launched later this month. And actually, I'm chairing something that we call a mission in EU. The EU have sort of launched 5 missions where they say, why don't we pool all our resources in addressing some very big challenges: oceans, plastic, cancer, soil and food, and then adaptation to climate change and societal change, where we are looking very much on what you just mentioned, Christina, resilience, because we think that in light of COVID, we have all seen what it means to ignore the warnings of science, meet them unprepared, not adapt to what we know is coming. So we are trying there to sort of think through, what does it really mean to become a resilient society? And we are sort of picking a huge number of regions with different kind of challenges to identify sort of what is it you really need, what is the best way to address your challenges in order to become resilient? And where are there some knowledge gaps that science should help us close in order to be resilient before we get to 2030? So there's a huge work going on sort of creating this resilience. It's social, it is health, it is technical with water, handling of water, too much of it or too little of it or whatever technologies, but it's also governance. How do we become, as I mentioned, sort of less silo focused? How can we work together in new manners? And also the behavioral point. How can we, and that is a big concern right now in Europe, you know, when you want to change society, how can you in democratic societies carry people? How can you carry the citizens so that they get along and really want to do this, so that we will not end up in a polarized world on these issues in Europe, which so far has not really been the case. It's, if you ask the Europeans, 70–80% of them would sort of be very much in favor of ambitious climate policies and expect their policymakers to deliver on that.
Thank you. In fact, there's a question here on the chat, on the Q&A, asking what is Denmark's or the Europeans' position in terms of collaborating and providing financial assistance in investigating, designing, implementing and monitoring climate change and environmental solutions, as you just mentioned, also, you know, resilient solutions in the African continent or any other developing countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that is part of what is happening now with, it happened with the old EU budget 7 years that expired here end of 20 and the new EU budget. There, 30% of the whole budget must be earmarked for moving us in the right direction when it comes to climate. And that also goes for the development budgets, for the development aid. So that is key, but the thing is that you will not help Africa a lot only through development aid. I mean, it's the private investments that really count. And that's also sometimes the problem with the COPs, the climate conferences, that there's so much focus on these public money spent, which of course is important, but it is even more important that private investors can go and invest in African countries. So what we're trying to do is to hedge or to sort of have systems that take off the worst risk, where the public goes in, public money goes in and sort of takes the 10 or 20% additional risk premium, but private money will go in. And for instance, the European Investment Bank and other multinational sort of multilateral players, they will to a much larger degree now go in there and again mainstream whatever activities they have there, so that they make sure that they are not financing initiatives that will not help us move towards a more low carbon world. For instance, a lot of European finance institutions have now made it clear that they are not going to put money into anything related to coal, even not in developing countries. So again, that is what sort of paves the way for more European investments on the African continent. Thank you.
I'm going to try and put 3 questions into one because they all relate to different forms of energy generation. Number one, what is the position of Denmark or Europe in terms of nuclear energy? Number 2, is waste to energy an important part of your energy policy in your country? And number 3 is what is Denmark's and the Europeans' perspective on carbon capture and storage?
Yeah, to start with number 3 first, we are investing in that at the EU level and also in Denmark. It's one of the big technological projects right now, carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and usage. I remember from my time as a commissioner, I think 10 years ago in Australia, this was a huge thing and there were huge expectations. I think that Australia even led the international coalition for CCS. And I don't know if you remember, but I remember that people said, yeah, by 2020, we would have CCS all over the place. That was not exactly what happened. We really tried to give it a boost in the EU Commission, but it just turned out it was really expensive. And some of the countries, Norway, for instance, have done a lot in this, invested billions and billions, but so far with not too much success. Nonetheless, we think that there is a potential there, particularly for many production companies and others, and to have it facilities. So we are investing in that. Of the innovation money will go in that direction. Sorry. Then the question on waste to energy. Yes, in Denmark, we have had a huge success with turning waste into energy. And that is sort of what is behind the central district heating. Now, however, we do have a challenge for the future because we have a lot of waste handlings and energy producing facilities that have been invested in. But now when we want to go in a more circular economy direction, you should not burn waste, then you should reuse and recycle it. So there are some challenges now, but because again, if people 10 years ago invested in a big facility for treating waste and making it to energy, you cannot just overnight change and say, oh, now we are moving into a circular economy direction. So right now it's challenging to sort of balance the right speed with which you can make this transition. But we have had huge success with that. No open landfills in Denmark. That was in my childhood, we had that, but now you would never see that in Denmark. So that has been a huge success story, but it has to change now because we're moving much more into upcycling, recycling, and reusing. And then the position on nuclear in Denmark, we have not had nuclear. The Danish parliament decided in 1985, they voted against nuclear, and then instead we sort of moved very much into the renewables direction. At the EU level, some countries have nuclear, some don't. It's up to each each member state to decide their energy mix. But EU will still support research for new generations of nuclear. So you will see in a number of European countries that they are coming back to nuclear. Also some who have not had it before, Finland and the Netherlands, for instance, they are now building nuclear power plants. One should only remember that it's really expensive. And if in doubt, ask in Finland, where they have seen that it was not only expensive in the planning phase, it was even more expensive before it is sort of up running there. I think in the UK right now, they have this huge plan that they want to build, Hinkley Point. So far, I mean, the economy looks as a disaster, and one of the big energy players in Europe withdraw from the project because they saw that it was too expensive. It was simply not profitable. So there are challenges there on the economic side, but you will have nuclear as part of the energy mix in different states in Europe.
Thanks, Connie. There's another question here. It's many of the top climate scientists and others are calling for the necessity to reach 2030 net zero globally in order to keep us safe and under 1.5 degrees. You mentioned all the plans for the next 2 to 3 decades. Can these plans be brought forward and achieved in 1 decade? And secondly, in some countries, national politicians see this much more ambitious 2030 target as a leftist agenda. So how do we make this a central agenda? Yeah.
The first on the zero emissions globally, there is a long way until we get there. I mean, sometimes it's also, yeah, we must be ambitious, but we also have to be realistic. We are becoming still more people on planet Earth. In Africa, south of Sahara, there will be an enormous boom in number of people who would want modern commodities and things like that. So I think we can come a long way with technology development and be better at applying them and disseminating them faster. But I still think that have a global zero emission target by 2050. I have not come across anybody who would say that that is realistic, but but for the developed world, that should be feasible. Sorry, Christina, what was the second question?
Oh, I guess it's how do we bring this to the center if it's seen as a left agenda?
Of the left. Yeah, that's right. Well, there again, I think to see it as an innovation agenda. To be very frank, I think that there is a risk that if the social market economy that most of us are living in, if the social market economy cannot handle the climate change challenge, I would fear that a young generation would lose their patience and more would call for much more radical solutions, be that anti-growth or a total change of system or revolution, call it whatever you want. I think that for those of us who are in favor of the capitalist system, there also is an obligation now to show that this system can handle this huge challenge. So I really think that we have to take care that we are delivering, not just talking and not just, oh, not now and can't it wait. I really think we don't have too much time to prove that this social market economic system can handle this kind of challenges. And one of the ways that it can handle it is through innovation. It is through using maybe also the digital options much better. We could disseminate good solutions and technologies much faster. Now, is that a daunting task? For sure it is. Yet on the other hand, I mentioned General Motors before, and Christina mentioned when you welcomed me that I'm on this Volkswagen Sustainability Board. I mean, in Volkswagen, they have now whole production units, whole company, production plants that are 100% producing electric vehicles. Nobody would have thought that 3, 4, 5 years ago. It is happening. I saw that in Germany in 2019, 3% of all new cars were electric in 19. The year after, 2020, it was 14% that was electric. So just to say, things are changing. I spoke with the CEO of Porsche. He said that by 2030, 70% of all new Porsches would be electric. So, I mean, huge innovation is happening. And I don't think we should underestimate the potential. We can do a lot, particularly if we are better at cooperating and also sort of have public-private partnerships. And maybe also one thing we should think about in sort of the West is our research communities. I don't know the figures for Australia. I know for Europe, for many years, we have sort of kept the public spending for research around 1% of our GDP. I mean, that percentage is higher, I assure you, in China. It's 4 to 5%. So there's also something there. Are we prioritizing innovation and research as much as the situation would require from us? But I think we can do it. But I think it's extremely important that it is a mainstream political agenda and not just something for the pros and the cons on the fringes.
And on the point of research, there's a question here. Could you comment on how in Denmark the carbon tax was actually given to companies for R&D to ensure that there's developing better energy efficiency products?
Yeah, there are systems. I cannot sort of the details of that, but there are systems that if you invest in research, then you can have deductions. So it pays off to do the research. But there is also a CO2 tariff, and that we have had since 30 years or something like that. One could easily argue it's not high enough, but it is there. But then it is being constructed in a way so that very energy intensive companies, they will sort of be cushioned a bit. If you're producing cement or you grow greens or whatever, you know, there can be some where you would have to sort of take care that in order for the jobs to stay in Denmark and not to be going elsewhere, that you would have to cushion them a bit for that. So that has been done in Denmark, and also in the European emissions trading scheme. Obviously, there are compensation. The incentives are built so that you know, it is you will get the quotas according to best in class, but some of the money will go back into a revolving system so that it can be benefiting those companies who are actually innovating and modernizing. And I think that's one of the discussions we will have even more in Denmark if the CO2 price is going to go up, and I would think that that is going to be the conclusion within the next year. Then quite a significant portion of that money will have to go back to business, earmarked for their innovation, because that's of course also a way that the sectors will much better accept that kind of taxes. And if I may, Christina, also there's one thing that is a big dividing line between right and left right now in Denmark, and that is on these CO2 prices. Because the conservative approach would be to say, okay, if we need a higher price on CO2 so that it cannot pay, I mean, it doesn't pay off to pollute, it's fine, and there should be an incentive to innovate. But then other taxes will have to be reduced accordingly. That would sort of be the right of center position for these negotiations, where if you're a social democrat or a leftist, you will not be preoccupied with that. So I think that that is one of the big ideological battles that we are in for the next few months. If you are increasing some taxes, then others should be reduced, or should an increased CO2 tax just be yet another increased tax?
Thanks, Connie. I think we've only got time for one more question. So what key actions could Australia learn and adopt from the transformation of Dong, the Danish oil and natural gas company, one of the most coal-intensive electricity companies, turning into Ørsted, a global giant in renewables?
Well, I'm not the one who should advise. I'm sure that the audience know the Australian situation in details much, much better than I do. But I think that one of the lessons that we have learned in Denmark is it works to agree on the long-term targets. You need time to do this. And it is incredibly important to try and have a strong political buy-in so that you will not have stop-go policies. Stop-go policies is poisonous for the companies who want to invest. So the broad coalitions, I really think that if there is any secret behind what we have been doing in Denmark, then it is that despite all the differences, there have been sort of a main road that different stakeholders and actors could sort of count on. That is there, that is not going to be changed. The government can change, majorities can change, but basically there is agreement on the broad, important direction here. And I think the sooner you can have that created, the better, because the worst for the whole transition here is if there is uncertainty, people are holding back, and suddenly you had to do a lot in a very, very short time span. That will end up being the least cost-efficient way to do that, and probably also end up not being an advantage when it comes to competitiveness. Remember, in Denmark, we really see it as part of our competitiveness. It's something that helps us create job, wealth, and exports. And I think that if you see it through that lens, it is actually something that creates new opportunities and not the opposite.
And I've heard you mention a few times too that reducing emissions is not up to the politicians only or to governments, but we all have to play a part as citizens, as small business owners, as corporations. What are those responsibilities in your view as consumers? What can we do to improve what we do?
I think there's a lot we can do. You know, now I mentioned cars a few times. What kind of car do we choose? What kind of commodity do we choose? What about our diet? I I know, I mean, 5 years ago in Denmark, if you just had mentioned this issue around sort of red meat and things like that, people would have thought you are absolutely crazy. Today, you can see in most families, they have changed their diets. If you ask the big supermarket chains, they can see that in line with more knowledge getting out there on what is best or worst for environment, people have started to change their diets. Something as difficult to change behavior with, but that sends signals to those producing the goods and the big meat producers, the big dairy producers. They have started to embrace and set ambitious zero emission targets. So, I mean, as consumers, we have a huge influence through our daily choices, but we also have an obligation. And I would say, particularly as a conservative person, I mean, I would not like to live in a society where this whole transformation came only top down from the state and down to each of us. So I think if you want to avoid that scenario, that kind of society, then each of us, wherever we are as citizens, as workers or employers in the daily business working life, or at the political level, we all can do something in our daily life to be more aware of this and incorporate it. And that's a big trick, not to have it set aside as, oh, that's environment. No, this is something that must be embedded in the way we think growth in the 21st century. And I think those who best understand that and first start to act accordingly, they will also be best positioned as societies, but also as companies in the competition of the 21st century.
Thanks, Connie. I would love to ask a lot more questions, but that's all the time we had for the Q&A. So I'd love to now ask Jason to step in and make the closing remarks and your vote of thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christina, and most especially thank you, Connie, for spending the time with us today. I think it's been an incredibly rich conversation, both in terms of really, I guess, going through the complexities, but also the solutions. And we know that this year is a very big year on this agenda. Much has changed just in a few short weeks, really, in terms of the framework for this year. What I particularly found interesting was some of your comments around it's a challenge for a market-based economies to show that it can adapt to change. I think that was one of the most penetrating things from your discussion, but also some of the ways in which you just outlined that this is in many ways very common sense. We know that electrification of fleets are coming. So rather than sort of debating about certain things, let's get on with just planning for what that future is inevitably going to look like. And these are, I think, some of the great challenges that you've commented on with real clarity for us. From my organisation, the EABC, we see enormous opportunities for more collaboration between Australia and Europe in some of the ways that I outlined before. We have a free trade agreement negotiation underway, which is, of course, about all of the traded goods, but it's about services. It's about collaboration on climate. It's about a whole range of other things, including Horizon Europe, which is an incredibly exciting platform for innovation collaboration. You mentioned marine sciences as just one area where obviously there's a huge amount Australia and Europe can be doing together. It's, I think, colleagues, remarkable to have someone who has been part of this agenda for a very long time, having chaired the COP meeting in Copenhagen back in 2009. Connie, we hope that you'll come back to Australia before too much longer. When that's possible again, of course. But I think for all of us, can I just say thank you very much for spending this time with us, and we look forward to all the good work that you continue to do.
Thank you. Nice being here. Take care.
Thank you, Jason, for taking part tonight. Again, Connie, thank you so much for enlightening us and sharing all the experience you've had. Hopefully we'll continue to talk to you behind the scenes and also have you again over for other perhaps face-to-face events. I hope this session was enlightening to everybody else as it was for me, and I can see there's a lot of people still, hanging on until the last minute on the audience. I just wanted to say that Coalition Conservation, we're very delighted to have people of our caliber participating at our events. We've been hosting a number of good events, and next week, as we talked about the corporate sector through Jason, we're hosting another event with 4 interesting panelists from the corporate sector discussing the role of corporates in decarbonizing the economy. And this will happen on Wednesday night at 6 p.m. So we hope that everybody can join us again. Other than that, thanks to the audience as well for participating and for all the great questions. And this concludes the event tonight. Thank you all for taking part, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.